Blue Cross and Blue Shield companies formed out of a need to provide affordable health care to teachers, loggers, and miners. We are now celebrating the 60th anniversary of the Blues, developing the National Labor Office to strengthen its commitment to organized labor. Blue Cross Blue Shield's National Labor Office remains focused on America's workers, advocating for affordable and equitable health care, partnering with strategic alliances to provide industry-leading products and services, and proudly serving more than 18 million unionized workers, retirees, and their families. Working hard for America's working families, for the health of America. Learn more by following them at Blue Labor on LinkedIn and X, formerly known as Twitter. And don't forget, you can check us out on Facebook or follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. That would be AWF Union Podcast, AWF Union Podcast. Let's go to line number 1. And welcome to the show, Jeff Schuhrke. Jeff is an assistant professor at the Harry Van Arsdale Jr. School of Labor Studies at the State University of New York. And this is another episode of what we call Labor 131. Where we're coming up to the 131st anniversary of the creation of Labor Day, going back to 1894. Professor Schuhrke, maybe you could give us a little background on yourself. And we usually start off the segments that way so I can get better acquainted with you and what you have done over the years. I salute your research, your books. And this is a 100% union show. We want to talk about the history of unions because it's important to know where we came from and the struggle of workers for, my gosh, well over a century here. So a little bit about yourself. Let's start right there. Go ahead.
All right. Well, I'm from Chicago originally, and several years ago I was working as a union organizer and researcher there on the early days of the Fight for 15 campaign. With SEIU, and eventually went to graduate school to do a PhD in history, focus on labor history at University of Illinois, Chicago. I was part of the graduate worker union there, the GEO, was co-president of the union for a while, and we went on strike in 2019, successful strike. And for many years, I've been a labor journalist, mainly writing for In These Times, and also writing for Jacobin a lot and some other publications. And now like you mentioned, assistant professor at the Van Arsdale School of Labor Studies in New York City. Our students are all apprentices from the local IBEW Local 3. As part of their apprenticeship, they have to get, the union requires them and pays for them to get at least an associate's or bachelor's degree in labor studies. And so they take classes with us in our program. And a lot of what I research and write about when it comes to labor history is about the role of the U.S. labor movement, the AFL-CIO, in foreign affairs, the history of that, especially during the Cold War, the mid to late 20th century, but a lot of other stuff as well.
That's interesting about Local 3 of the IBEW. We've had it on the show a couple of times. That partnership that you just referred to, has that been going on for quite some time?
Yeah, over 50 years now.
Wow.
Started by Harry Van Arsdale Jr. himself. He was the business manager for Local 3, as well as the president of the New York City Central Labor Council.
That's interesting. I didn't realize it was going on that long, but thanks for referencing that on the show. Well, let's talk about your first book. Your first book was on the AFL-CIO's anti-communist foreign policy, which pretty much happened during the Cold War. What did you find out about that, Jeff?
Yeah, well, I should say the book is called Blue Collar Empire. And this is something that, it's somewhat of an uncomfortable topic in a lot of labor circles, but I think as a historian, it's important to know about it, to talk about it. There was a lot of, and when we talk about labor history going all the way back to the late 19th century, a lot of radicals, left-wing people, socialists and communists were really a key part of building the unions in this country. Especially the 1930s with the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, the unionization of the auto industry, steel industry, rubber, electrical, et cetera. A lot of the union organizers behind that were part of the Communist Party at the time in the 1930s. And what happened with the beginning of the Cold War, right after World War II, a lot of the non-communist labor leaders wanted to push the communists and other radical leftists out of union leadership positions. This was the period of McCarthyism and these like witch hunts, and even people who weren't actually communists, if they were just sort of left-wing progressive, they could be painted as communists and thrown out of the labor movement. The CIO expelled 11 of its unions, and coming out of that history, then going into the later half of the 20th century, some of the key leaders of the AFL-CIO, like George Meany, who was the president of the AFL-CIO for many years from the 1950s to 1979, and then Lane Kirkland, his successor as president of the AFL-CIO in the 80s and early 90s, they really were kind of, and I think this is detrimentally fixated on showing off how patriotic and loyal to the U.S. government they could be, and going after any kind of left-wing or progressive or militant labor organization union around the world, whether in Europe, Latin America, Africa, Asia, and partnering with the U.S. government and trying to, sometimes often partnering with the CIA and the State Department in trying to undermine the more kind of militant unions around the world. So it's a history that people have talked about. They've sort of whispered about AFL-CIA, and maybe people have heard that before. And a lot of times it's talked about in terms of like conspiracy theories or kind of negative against labor. And I'm very pro-union and pro-labor. And the idea of the book, Blue Collar Empire, is to really take a real. And what I did was, I went into the archives of the AFL-CIO and several major unions like the UAW, among others, and looked and also referred to a lot of research that's been done by other historians and journalists over the years to try to get the real story of what this was all about and what impact it had on workers' movements around the world, and how what I argue is it was ultimately pretty negative, because it meant as more and more labor movements in Latin America, Asia, and elsewhere were being divided and weakened, in part because the AFL-CIO was sort of intervening in this Cold War crusade. It meant that it was easier for multinational corporations to then move into these countries and move U.S. jobs overseas, because they didn't have strong, unified militant labor movements to deal with, because they had been weakened for so long.
Let me ask you this. Militancy and communism, are they kind of intertwined? And I bring that up because you fast forward to today, and you've got some militant labor leaders. I'm going to call attention to two of them, Shawn Fain, UAW, and Sean O'Brien of the Teamsters. They have a different way of approaching the leadership positions that they have. And yeah, they've been militant on all that. But do you see that connection in your eyes?
Often. I mean, it's not like a, 100% overlap, or that it has to be. But historically, when we talk about like the history of the CIO in the 1930s, and it doesn't have to even just be communism per se, but people who are more left wing, I suppose, who have a view of the labor movement that it's about bringing together workers of all different races and nationalities and religions, and not being divided along those kinds of identity lines, and really advocating for more power and more control in the workplace, and pushing for broader social justice and a broader changing society as a whole, as opposed to only focusing on, what's in it for me or what's in it for my membership of my union. Obviously, that's still the priority, but also having a wider vision. That has historically been the more radicals, including communists and socialists, among others, anarchists, throughout the history of the labor movement in this country and around the world as well. And when you start to say, well, you can't, when you start to try to, and I should back up and say that a lot of the unions that were being kind of undermined and divided and split around the world, in part by the AFL-CIO's leaders working with the CIA and State Department, were not even necessarily communist or pro-Soviet Union or anything like that. They were just maybe didn't want to be subservient to, the United States, or they wanted to be more independent. They wanted to really advocate for their members, for the working class of their countries, and yet they were just labeled communist because it was an easy way to try to vilify different workers' movements. But when you start to try to say, well, you can't talk about certain political things, or you can't, this union is only, because historically, unfortunately, especially going back to the early 20th century, a lot of the unions in the U.S. were, pretty much just for like the most highly skilled, often white male workers, and other less skilled immigrant workers, women workers, African-American workers were being excluded. And it was the more radicals, again, like communists, socialists, and others, who were saying, no, we need to bring the whole working class together. And that is thankfully more accepted now today in the U.S. labor movement, but that's because of those radicals in the past. So anyway, hopefully that kind of answers the question a little.
Yeah. No, I follow you. Anytime you're pro-worker, you're an anarchist or you're a socialist. I mean, you've seen the guy that won the primary in New York,
Zoran Mamdani.
Yeah. Oh my God. The name calling that went on there, and you're going to probably hear more of it, especially when it comes closer to the election, because he's for the people. He's for the people. If you're for the people, you're against America.
Right.
That's just the way it is. I saw a piece, I think this was in these Times, that you posted how Biden, Harris, and the Democrats abandoned the working class. And I'll tell you, there's a lot to be said about that. I know Bernie Sanders, another one who's been called a socialist and a communist, he's been very vocal about that. I like to ask you, what happened? What happened there? Because and the parties changed. Let's be honest about that. Unions and the Democrats, very close over the years. But when unions went down in density, well, the Democrats needed some partners. And that's where they aligned with corporate America. Is that what happened, in your opinion, to the Democratic Party in America?
Yeah. I mean, I wrote that piece shortly after the election in November. And part of what Biden was in many ways the most pro-union president we've had in many, at least since Franklin Roosevelt, in a lot of ways. But I argue that it still wasn't quite enough. On the campaign trail in 2020, one of the things, when Biden had like a behind closed doors meeting with wealthy donors, he told them, nothing will fundamentally change if I'm elected. I think those were his exact words. And I think that was that's sort of the broader problem with the Democratic Party, in my opinion, especially the last 30, 40 years or so, is that while they're willing to make certain changes and adjustments to help the working class, they're not interested in more transformative, fundamental change because, for example, things like what Bernie Sanders and others talk about a lot, Medicare for all, right? That's a fundamental kind of change. And, it's a shift in how we do healthcare, and it gets us on board with the rest of, again, the theme of internationalism. It's how most of the rest of the industrialized world does healthcare, is single payer healthcare. But the reason why the Democrats don't actually embrace those kinds of things like Medicare for all, and I'm talking about the Democratic Party establishment, is because, like you mentioned, they rely so much on like the private health insurance industry and so many other wealthy corporate interests, Wall Street, for their donations, obviously, and as consultants and so on and so forth. So that was sort of what I was getting at in the piece. And I was also talking about how, there was a pretty bold, relatively bold agenda that Biden came in with in 2020 about things like making community colleges tuition free and making, having paid sick leave be guaranteed to all workers. Again, the U.S. is one of the only countries that doesn't do that, having paid sick leave and paid family and medical leave guaranteed. These were things that the Biden administration was pushing, as well as raising the federal minimum wage finally to $15 an hour, because it's been stuck at $7.25 since 2008, I think, or 2009. So these were things that they were promising to do, but then ultimately didn't fulfill Part of that, of course, a big part of it had to do with Joe Manchin and Kyrsten Sinema in the Senate. But also, I argued in that piece that Biden wasn't really fighting for these policies as much as he could have been. And a lot of the COVID era social safety net expansions that we saw in 2020 and 2021, the expansion of the child tax credit, for example, or expanded unemployment insurance, these things were rolled back. They expired. They weren't continued. And just as there was this growing inflation and cost of living crisis that was starting to bubble up around 2021, 2022. So that's where the headline of abandon the working class kind of comes into play, because so many people were working class people across the country were benefiting from a lot of the COVID era social safety net expansions, and then that was all being taken away right as everything was getting, the price of groceries was going up, and Biden had come in with this bold agenda and then kind of backed off of it after the first year or two, in my opinion, and that's in many ways what explains Trump winning. And I think it also, going back to Zoran Mamdani in New York, kind of goes back to why he won, because that's what he's talking about, cost of living. New York City, I live in New York City. It's really a difficult place to live because of how ridiculously expensive everything is, especially the rent, groceries, transportation. And that's what Mamdani focused on. And he actually went and talked to some of the people who voted for Trump shortly after the election in November. And instead of just writing them off and saying, working class people who voted for Trump, and instead of just writing them off, he listened to them and said, why, what's going on? Why didn't you vote for Biden or for Harris, for the Democrats? And they said, well, things are just too expensive. It's too difficult and, to make a living. And we're hoping that, with a new party in power, with Trump in power, that he'll address these things. Of course, Trump has no interest in doing anything like that. Mamdani listened to them and made his whole campaign about affordability.
This is another segment of Labor 131 as we commemorate the 131st anniversary of Labor Day. And our featured guest today is Jeff Schuhrke, who's a professor of labor studies at the State University of New York. I would assume that you are pretty engaged with your students. I'm sure classes will start up here shortly. How are you being received? How are you as a labor studies professor? And I bring that up because unions are popular. They've been popular right now. Gallup says over 70% approval rating, which is probably the highest rating in over 50 years, and very popular, especially among young people. We're seeing a lot of organizing at Starbucks, Trader Joe's, places like that, retail establishments. But how are you being received in New York? And New York is a relatively union-friendly state, but I'm just wondering about the future of labor, especially with those students that you're talking to on a daily basis.
Well, yeah, again, the students that I have they're all union members or apprentices from IBEW Local 3. So it's a really unique kind of, student body, not like, your typical college student.
Right.
But and specifically as a labor historian, I teach the labor history classes because they're learning about they have classes on like collective bargaining and labor law and a number of other topics related to labor studies, economics for workers, things like that. But in my classes, they're learning about history. And I think they really do, they're often really engaged because of how often they see the struggles of workers and unions in the past, how similar they are to the struggles that they go through today as workers and members, and the same kinds of tactics of the bosses and the wealthy and corporate interests. Like we were talking about, painting anyone who is for the people as some kind of evil, diabolical, radical, or else often using different types of tactics of the government, whether it's lawsuits and injunctions or actual, outright violence of having police or state militias come out and attack workers. That's a common theme throughout U.S. labor history. Thankfully, that kind of violence doesn't happen so much anymore, but now it's much more moved into the sort of legal stuff and, union busters, psychological games and things like that, but it's still the same idea of trying to frighten workers into not organizing for their own rights and their own well-being. So when the students, learn about all this stuff, it's I think, especially because they're young union members as apprentices in Local 3 of IBEW, that they kind of really feel a connection to the workers and union members of the past, and hopefully are inspired to want to continue the legacy of a lot of the past labor activists and organizers.
Well, that truly is a unique situation, and one that sounds pretty darn exciting to me. I think that's awesome. Jeff, I'm going to let you go on that note. Jeff Schuhrke, our featured guest today, assistant professor at the Harry Van Arsdale Jr. School of Labor Studies at the State University of New York. You take care. Keep doing what you're doing and keep in touch with us here on America's Workforce, okay?
Okay, thanks a lot.
And that'll be it for another edition of America's Workforce. Coming up tomorrow, we're going to check in with the United Steelworkers and talk about the industrial workers of the world. Another edition of Labor 131. That's tomorrow. Until then, all of you have a safe and wonderful day.